The Armorican Peninsula, literally on the sea, has, as long as written record recalls, been inhabited by Celts. During the time of Julius Caesar, these Celts were the Gauls, and his war would result in their subjugation for over 400 years. Over this period of time, the Gauls would progressively Romanize and, eventually, forget their language. Precisely when this happened is unclear, so when bands of Britons came over the English Channel between the 5th and 7th centuries, likely fleeing the disorganized mess caused by the Roman abandonment of Britain and the ensuing invasions from Ireland and the Anglo-Saxons, we don't know whether the Gauls of the Armorican Peninsula were Latin or Gaulish speakers, or even how populated it was before the arrival of the Britons. For most of us, this question has no importance, and in any case, this video is the same, whether or not the Armorican Gauls were still Gaulish-speaking. But, some 1500 years later, after the Second World War, for some of the descendants of these immigrants and refugees, the answer to this question was an important showing of allegiance to the state which they then and still belonged to, France, after a tiny contingency of them made the deplorable choice of collaborating with the enemy. You see, in France, there is a sort of mythical saying, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, a way of tying the modern French nation to the ancestral Gaul that it inhabits. This people, now making up one part of the French nation, can also claim this mythical ancestry. On top of that, if it is indeed true that the Armorican Gauls were still Gaulish-speaking, then the descendants of the Breton immigrants may, in addition to carrying the torch of the Gaulish people, claim to inherit part of their language, which would have inevitably left its trace on theirs, effectively making them doubly French. I don't want to derail this analysis too much at the start, so I'll leave it at this. There is no definitive evidence that Gaulish was still the main language of Armorica by the arrival of the Britons, although it is possible that Gaulish was still spoken, or that the Latin spoken on Armorica was heavily influenced by Gaulish. These Britons who settled the Armorican Peninsula are the only Celts from the island of Britain to keep their ancestral name. Today we call them Bretons. The settlers would organize into a few different polities on the peninsula, spreading their language with them, roughly ending at this line, running from around Mont Saint-Michel to the Loire estuary. These states often fought each other and were also gradually subjugated by the Franks, who wanted to conquer all of Gaul. After the division of Francia, the Breton leader Nominoé managed to push the weakened Franks further east, conquering the towns of Rennes and Nantes, and proclaiming the Kingdom of Brittany. The diocesan, or religious Catholic organization of this new kingdom is linguistically important, and in western Brittany, where those Bretons first landed some 400 years prior, the ecclesiastical organization was split between the dioceses of Cerne, Leun, Tréguer, and Gwenet. These are the traditional boundaries between the varieties of Breton. The varieties of the north and west, KLT, are closer together when comparing the particularly phonologically divergent G. The next 60 or so years are when we can claim that Brittany had true independence from any foreign power. This was interrupted when, starting at the beginning of the 10th century, Viking raids on Brittany accelerated, and its religious establishments were pillaged, destroying much of the Breton literature that had been written up to that point. Many members of the Breton elite fled these invasions, a few of them taking pieces of writing with them. One of these refugees and heir to the Breton throne was Alain Barbetorte, who fled to England. During this short period of some 30 years, the Norse ruled Brittany. In 936, Alain Barbetorte returned to Brittany and fought back the Viking settlers, proclaiming the Duchy of Brittany, and avoiding what had happened in neighboring Normandy. While technically maintaining its independence, Brittany, after the decades of instability, was weak, and created close connections to the French monarchy, which would inevitably lead to its annexation by the much larger and more powerful monarchy. After the proclamation of the Duchy of Brittany, most members of the aristocracy and upper class became bilingual French-speaking. This probably contributed to how, after a supposed 500 years of independence, the Romance-speaking capital cities of Rennes and Nantes were not Celticized. In fact, over the next 900 years, the linguistic border in Brittany only moved westward. This developed the two distinct cultural zones that make up Brittany, or even as others put it, the two Brittanies. Lower or Celtic-speaking Brittany, and Upper or Oilic-speaking Brittany, the specific Romance language being Gallo. This gives Brittany a unique character, as despite being a political unit, has two distinct linguistic identities within its borders. Up until around 1450, we continue to have very little textual evidence for Breton, though what we do have from this period shows that French influence had already started to reflect on Breton, which over the centuries inherited an incredibly large amount of French vocabulary. And just because every piece of literature that presents itself as an overview on Breton quotes this poetic fragment, it feels kind of important, so here it is.
An gwyn, hegwyn am luenas, an hegarat an lakat glas, mar ham goront vacarantic, davutin no soe kostik, vam garet.
Around 100 years after the penning of this saucy number, came the first book that eventually became the first Breton print, the Catholicon. This was a Breton, French, Latin dictionary written by a Breton priest, where the entries are in Breton, the definitions in French and Latin, and the explanations in Latin. Throughout the 16th century, members of the clergy wrote more religious works in Breton, and most of this writing was done in a sort of loosely standardized form. Brittany's close relationship with France ultimately culminated in the joining of the Duchy of Brittany to the Kingdom of France through an edict in 1532. This document spells out a couple of privileges that Brittany would get to keep as a new province of France, despite it no longer having a monarch separate from the King of France. One of these, being shared with some other provinces of France, was that it got to keep its estates, and in addition to this, the edict joining the two nations explicitly states that the French crown had the responsibility to keep the traditional customs of Brittany, which we can assume language is part of. This effectively resulted in a linguistic status quo in Brittany for the next 250 years. In the 1650s, the literate class of clergymen started writing in the Breton varieties, and often heavily infused with French. Though, there were some writers of the 16th and 17th centuries who were concerned with the level of Francization and made attempts to write in a more Celticized version of the language. This kind of altered Breton was given the derisive moniker Priest's Breton, because it wasn't necessarily as easy to comprehend. For what are probably quite complex and varied reasons that aren't completely known to me, Lyon and Vannes were the most religiously devout dioceses of Brittany, and thus had more seminaries and so created more members of the clergy. This in turn led to these varieties of Breton having a stronger literary presence. This linguistic power gave them more weight later on when standardizing the Breton language became something of greater importance, but we'll tackle that in a bit. Brittany, now a part of France, developed to have some of the kingdom's most important ports, which created an economic situation where the French-speaking or bilingual Breton upper classes were incredibly wealthy. But the common folk in Brittany were quite poor and living simple lives. The stereotyped Breton peasant of the late 18th century, product of this period, was immortalized in the words of Victor Hugo. Ce sauvage, grave et singulier, cet homme à l'œil clair et aux longs cheveux, vivant de lait et de châtaigne, borné à son toit de chaume, à sa haie et à son fossé, ne se servant de l'eau que pour boire, respectant son maître dans son bourreau, parlant une langue morte, ce qui est faire habiter une tombe à sa pensée, piquant ses bœufs, aiguisant sa faux, sarclant son blé noir, pétrissant sa galette de sarrasin, vénérant sa charrue d'abord, sa grand-mère ensuite, croyant à la Sainte Vierge et à la Dame Blanche, dévot à l'autel et aussi à la haute pierre mystérieuse debout au milieu de la lande, aimant ses rois, ses seigneurs, ses prêtres, ses poux. Not exactly a stunning review. The linguistic situation only started to change in 1789 with the start of the French Revolution. All of Brittany's special privileges were permanently lost, and Brittany became an ordinary region in the Republic of France. Attitudes towards France's minority languages, while probably never overtly positive, soured considerably during the Revolution. These languages were considered anti-French and anti-Republican. One particularly dramatic and fervently revolutionary report went like this. Nous avons révolutionné le gouvernement, les lois, les usages, les mœurs, les costumes, le commerce et la pensée même. Révolutionnons donc aussi la langue. Le fédéralisme et la superstition parlent bas breton. L'émigration et la haine de la République parlent allemand. La contre-révolution parle l'italien. Et le fanatisme parle le basque. Cassons ces instruments de dommage et d'erreur. Les habitants des campagnes n'entendent que le bas breton. C'est avec cet instrument barbare de leurs pensées superstitieuses que les prêtres et les intrigants les tiennent sous leurs empires, dirigeant leur conscience et empêchant les citoyens de connaître les lois et d'aimer la République. Vos travaux leur sont inconnus, vos efforts pour leur affranchissement sont ignorés. L'éducation publique ne peut s'y établir, la régénération nationale y est impossible. Les conséquences de cet idiome trop longtemps perpétué et trop généralement parlé dans les 5 départements de l'Ouest sont si sensibles que les paysans confondent le mot loi et celui de religion. The annihilation of France's minority languages became an important policy piece for Republican governments. Other examples from French officials directly or indirectly in charge of the education program in Brittany actively demanding the death of this language in particular are prominent. Remember that the following comments are made about a majority monolingual population. In response to an 1831 proposal that Breton children have elements of a bilingual education, one prefect, in opposition, stated « Il faut absolument détruire le langage breton ». And nearly a century later, in 1925, Anatole de Monzy, Minister of Education, who...
I like a baguette.
Straightforwardly said, pour l'unité linguistique de la France, la langue bretonne doit disparaître. The destruction of Breton and the other languages of France was the product of a concerted, centuries-long, and consistent effort. In education, the impact of the revolutionary fervency was the 1793 decree that all public schools in France be forced to use the French language exclusively, only using regional languages as an auxiliary. Evidence shows us that the implementation of this was somewhat limited. A report from 1863, 70 years later, showed that in Finistère and Breton-speaking Morbihan, only a quarter of schools were not using Breton. So the status quo seemed to continue for a brief while longer, and Lower Brittany was still effectively monolingual Breton-speaking, and the beginning of the 19th century saw the first real attempts to standardize the Breton language by Le Gonidec, who wrote a grammar and dictionary of Breton. The variety he chose to base his standard off of was the Léon variety. An additional effort that he made, like some priests of a few centuries prior, was to purge the language of most of its French influence, and would often neologize or create new words from older Breton forms, or when those didn't exist, borrowing from Welsh. Around the 1860s, railways penetrating deep into Brittany's Breton-speaking western coast were completed, thus attracting not only the French-speaking railway workers, but also Parisian tourists. Brittany also had a few economic exports that were interesting to outsiders from either within France or in other European countries. Speaking French with these people was a must, and bilingualism, while certainly not widespread, started becoming more common in Brittany. Still, Breton monolingualism was perfectly normal until Jules Ferry, a parliamentarian, passed his 1880s laws that made primary education in France public, mandatory, free, secular, and, important for our story, in French. The application of these laws was far more strict than those prior, and Breton would no longer be heard in the schools of Brittany. This was further supplemented by the world's favorite method of linguicide. It goes by many names and has been used on all continents, but in France and its colonies they call it le symbole, a stick, rock, or little wooden shoe that was passed to whichever student spoke Breton, and which could only be gotten rid of by ratting out a fellow classmate. The one still holding the symbole at the end of the day would be punished mentally or physically, thus instilling the idea that Breton equals shame. linguistic census data is not collected in France, which for me is great, because I don't have to go searching for it in obtuse databases and make maps showing it. But it's also kind of annoying, because people have had to estimate how many Breton speakers there are. With that being said, it is estimated that in the early years of the 20th century, out of a population of 1.5 million, there were 1.4 million speakers of Breton, with only 500,000 of those also speaking French. Now, that is a lot. That's a lot of speakers. 900,000 Breton monolinguals only a little more than 100 years ago. That is a lot of speakers. What that means is that in the early 20th century, there were more speakers of Breton than there had ever been speakers of Welsh at any given time. In fact, there were more speakers of Breton than there were speakers of any other Celtic language. Without getting too caught up on the other languages of France that we still have things to talk about in future videos, this kind of super express linguistic decimation that happens in the span of only a couple of generations is a ubiquitous experience for the languages of France. These early years of the 20th century saw the growing interest of non-native Breton speakers in the Breton language as a tool for nation building. More people were writing grammars and dictionaries in a sort of formalized and defrancized Breton. There were also some promising literary developments by near-native or native Breton speakers such as Calvez, whose life was cut short in the trenches during the First World War. Still, the First World War was not deadly to the Breton language. Even though Breton speakers were drafted to fight for the French army and many of them learned at least some French, if not becoming effectively fluent, this likely wasn't the first time that Breton soldiers were drafted, and in any case, bilingualism isn't a bad thing. Bilingualism doesn't automatically cause an entire people to stop using one language in favor of another. French bilingualism was an obvious eventuality for the Bretons in Lower Brittany, who would, if they wanted to have any sort of power within the Republic of France, or even talk to the people from their own country, would need to learn the French language. Bilingualism isn't the problem. The problem was the method with which French monolingualism was imposed on the people of Brittany. The interwar period saw the proliferation of Breton nationalism, and what we can call the beginning of the Breton literary Renaissance, though Renaissance is, I think, a poor choice of word, as it implies continuity with something earlier when this movement was quite new. Much of the Breton literature and the foundational ideas of Breton nationalism were created by the Breton elite, who, more often than not, were not native Breton speakers and didn't come from Breton-speaking families. It was still the case that most Breton speakers were poor, and because the schools of Brittany were legally blocked from using Breton, the children of Breton speakers weren't regularly learning to read or write in the language. But this new literary movement wasn't meant for those people anyway. Ropard-Zemont founded the Breton literary review Goualard in 1925, and in a manifesto he wrote with Olivier Mordrel a year prior, exclaimed that Goualard n'est une revue littéraire destinée à l'élite du public bretonnant. Il s'agit de savoir s'il existe en Bretagne un public assez instruit du breton pour pouvoir comprendre la langue littéraire, aussi distante du langage du paysan breton que la langue d'Anatole France l'est de celle du paysan français. Il s'agit de savoir s'il existe en Bretagne un public assez dégagé du provincialisme que son éducation française lui avait assigné. The gist is that Breton literature and the new Breton standard were made by the elite and for the elite. This is the start of a notable schism in the small Breton-speaking world, and the creation of a clear separation between people who learn Breton at home or in the community versus those that learned Breton from the aforementioned grammars and dictionaries. For the rest of this video, I'll use the terms traditional speaker to refer to those people who came by Breton through the home or the community and who natively speak one of the varieties of Breton, and neo-speaker to refer to someone who has come by Breton by, for now, learning it later in life, and learned standard Breton first as opposed to one of the traditional varieties. The Second World War was a period of pretty substantial change in Brittany. In 1941, a unified orthographic standard was created, merging elements of the orthography used in Léonard and Vaneté, called Pour une vent, This orthography is otherwise known as the ZH orthography for its inclusion of this digraph, which in the KLT varieties is either pronounced Z or S, depending on its environment, and in G is pronounced something like H. This orthography was adopted by the Gualarn Journal, and today is the most popular orthography used for Breton. In the same year, the Department of Loire-Atlantique, which includes the city of Nantes, was severed from the region of Brittany by the occupying powers of France. Also during the German occupation, a small portion of a separatist political party collaborated with the Nazi Party and the government of Vichy France in order to gain higher autonomy or independence for Brittany. Of course, the occupation ended shortly after, and several individuals were punished for their betrayal. Though still today, some elements of the Breton revitalization movement and even the Periphery orthography are sometimes criticized for having their roots in this deeply anti-French ideology. Loire-Atlantique was never reattached to Brittany. Gualarn shut down together with many other Breton publications, and the Breton language was slightly tainted in the eyes of traditional speakers because of this ugly chapter. After the Second World War, the opinion of the Breton language by its native and largest speaker base soured considerably, and most people stopped transmitting the language to their children. The next 20 to 30 odd years, when children were born, they were not acquiring the language. Some people may have learned to understand Breton, but very, very few learned to speak it. The government's campaign was ultimately successful, and people now had such negative associations with the Breton language that they didn't want to burden their children by teaching it to them. Only 7 years after the war, this demographic shift was already noticeable through numbers. It's estimated that 27% of Lower Brittany were monolingual French speakers. While there were still 1.1 million Breton speakers, only 100,000 of those were monolinguals. Breton was still the most spoken Celtic language, but the ball had only started rolling. Meanwhile, the education system had ever so slightly opened up to the idea of regional languages in school, and the Deixonne law was passed in 1951, allowing 1 to 3 hours of language instruction per week. Ultimately, this symbolic gesture had little impact on the teaching of minority languages, and Breton in school was a rarity. In 1962, the number of speakers dropped precipitously, reaching a new low of 686,000. An interesting sociological note that unfolded from the 1920s to the 1970s was the fact that, in Breton-speaking communities, young women were far less likely to speak Breton than young men. The reasons for this are ultimately unclear, but may have to do with women wanting to marry someone rich from outside of their community, a francophone. In 1977, the continuing opposing force of neo-speakers, who wanted to maintain Breton rather than let it die, set up the first Diwan school in Lampol-Ploudalmézeau. Diwan is a non-profit school system that teaches Breton through immersion. From their humble beginnings in 1977, they have since opened 47 primary schools, 6 middle schools, and 2 high schools. Starting in 1944, Diwan schools were allowed to be associated with the French government. Basically, what this means is that once a new school has been open for 2 years, the French government pays teachers' salaries. In 2024, just under 4,000 students attended Diwan schools, and the schools continue to grow due not only to the immersion Breton education they provide, but also because these are just good schools, and students do better than the national average on their high school exit exam. In 1982, the Circulaire Savary permitted the teaching of regional languages in public schools. A parents' organization, Diviez, 2 languages, created a few years prior, took the opportunity to start introducing Breton into certain public schools with the intent of having bilingual education, where 50% of the content is in French and 50% in Breton. In 2024, they were operating in 230 elementary schools, 46 middle schools, and 8 high schools with over 11,000 students. The last Breton educational opportunity comes in the form of private Catholic schools, for which a bilingual association was created in 1990 under the name Dian. Although they now go by Divasquel, they use the same 50-50 method as in the public schools. They have some 50 schools and over 5,000 students. All of these schools use standard Breton in their education. Our estimate for the number of Breton speakers in 1987 is 614,000, this time including an additional 200,000 people who claim to understand the language. Only 10 years later, the estimate plummets to 240,000 people, with 140,000 who can understand. At this point, there are no more Breton monolinguals. The demography of this language is not unexpected, but it is still shocking. In 1997, nearly 60% of speakers are older than 60. 80% of speakers only use the language occasionally. Of course, the reasons behind this aren't hidden. In the 1920s, 60% of children in Lower Brittany were learning Breton from their parents. In the 1980s, it was only 6%. The Brittany region, the departments within it, and the region of Loire-Atlantique provide the vast majority of the funding for Breton programs. There are also a few organizations that exist to promote and understand the language and how to proliferate it, the most important one being the Office Public Art Bretonne. Very little funding comes to Breton from the French state for constitutional reasons. In general, the French Constitution, since 1992, has been repeatedly interpreted as blocking any sort of public endorsement of France's languages other than French, and the only recognition they publicly get is les langues régionales appartiennent au patrimoine de la France, which is pretty much a nothing burger. In 2004 and then 2012, the Brittany region produced a document detailing its linguistic policy, which I would divide into political goals that won't be reached for a long time, and long-term linguistic policy that has good intentions but may fall short in practice. The Public Office of the Breton Language tells us that in 2018 there were 225,000 speakers and 125,000 understanders. 80% of speakers were over 60. On January 20th of 2025, another estimate was published, with the number of speakers falling to only 107,000, and that while the average age of Breton speakers has fallen, those over 60 still make up the majority. This survey has been criticized for having a sample size of only 8,000, though the number of Breton speakers has undoubtedly fell. The modern day. Now, all of that was important. It's important to understand how we got to the situation we are currently in. Some parts were confusing, but many were even too blatant. I can finally talk about what I think is the most fascinating part about the modern Breton language, and the thing that the 3 other videos on this topic miss out on, and that is the distinction between traditional speakers and neo-speakers. Really, when we're talking about Breton in the 21st century, we're talking about 2 distinct languages, which, despite their common origin, have very different purposes. I'm going to give you 2 generalized profiles of what the speakers of these languages are like. Breton, the language that came on boats from Great Britain, is a dying language that's primarily spoken by septuagenarians and octogenarians. This language is used by the oldest generation of a rural people in Lower Brittany between friends and family of a similar age. The people who speak this language don't know how to read or write it. They won't speak it to people from outside of their bubble. They believe the language they speak is worthless, and they think the idea of a national Breton identity is ridiculous. Breton, on the other hand, is a language that has been constructed over the past 150 so years, and it was constructed to be the language of a nation. Its speakers are generally young, their pronunciation is notably French, they're virtually all literate, and in fact probably have more experience writing and reading the language than speaking it. They are proud of the language, and they would be happy to identify themselves as Breton. What I haven't told you so far is that, for the most part, these 2 languages are not mutually intelligible. And it's not only because they differ in grammar and vocabulary and idiomatics, which they do, but because their purposes are so fundamentally different. First, let's understand the linguistic differences. vocabulary is probably one of the greatest changes here. Standard Breton is the offspring of a concerted effort to rid Breton of as much French as possible. As such, many French loanwords that are used in the traditional varieties of Breton have been replaced with Bretonized forms, either from Celtic roots or older versions of words, or even Welsh. This artificial process that non-native Breton speakers had a heavy hand in has led to a pretty weird mix of words with sometimes obtuse etymologies. The side effect of this is that when one of these words is dropped in conversation between a neo-speaker and a traditional speaker, the traditional speaker is going to have no idea what the neo-speaker is on about. Pronunciation is another change. While I can't recall reading any reports that said pronunciation was a major barrier to understanding between the two groups, neo-pronunciation is often characterized as being notably French. In general, Standard Breton is considered as having a phonology that is very accepting of French phonology, and thus probably working to counterbalance the efforts made to remove French vocabulary from Breton in the first place. The third major linguistic difference between these two languages is something that one author calls RAEs, rhetorical strategies, aesthetic principles, and expressive practices. This sort of includes a lot of things, so it's not only your intonation or the way you tell a story in a language, but it's also how you formulate your sentences, and neo-speakers, unsurprisingly, often do this in a way that is markedly French. One funny example of this has to do with the phrase making the bed, which in French is said faire le lit. A neo-speaker might directly translate this into Breton as ober arguelle, even though the traditional Breton way to say this would be dressant arguelle, where dressant is the verb to arrange. This might seem irrelevant until you learn that ober arguelle is awfully similar to the traditional euphemism for making love. As you can tell, even through just the linguistic differences, there are a few hurdles that need to be jumped in order for mutual comprehension to be achieved. And it isn't without some serious relearning that two speakers from the different groups may be able to understand each other. But, of course, for that learning to happen, these two groups need to meet to begin with, which, for reasons I'll discuss now, doesn't happen too often. We're now going to look at the social differences between these languages. First off, traditional Breton speakers typically speak one variety of Breton that they use in their pays, with other people they already know speak Breton. The phrase « il ne parle pas le même breton» encapsulates this idea that Breton is highly fragmented. The amount of linguistic diversity in this language is probably greater than for any other Celtic language. Native speakers are aware of that, so when they want to speak with someone from another part of Brittany, they use what they see as the lingua franca. French. So when a neo-speaker rolls around and a traditional speaker realizes il ne parle pas le même breton, they're just going to switch to French. Geography and age play important roles here too. It's not exactly an attractive prospect for a young city dweller to roll up on a countryside retirement home an hour or more away to practice their Breton with a bunch of 80-year-olds who don't want to speak Breton with them anyway. Literacy reflects on the situation too, as it makes online encounters more difficult. Finally, it's the purposes of these languages that make them so incredibly different. Standard Breton, as we showed, was created to act as a national language for the Breton nation-state. As a national language, Standard Breton has all the vocabulary and prestige of French or Italian or Uzbek, so it can be used in any situation from a pub chat to a meeting of parliament, and can be used to talk about any subject from how much manure is needed to fertilize 1 hectare of land to how tenable the existence of gravitons are. Traditional Breton, on the other hand, has been the language of a class of largely disenfranchised peasants for the better part of 1,000 years. It's well known that traditional Breton speakers may often greet each other in Breton, but when the topic of conversation switches to business, so too does the language switch to French. What do we do now? We have two languages with the same name, but a speaker of one is basically living on a different planet from a speaker of the other. Standard Breton has been named as a necessary evil by some. Its expansion of Breton vocabulary, often imperfect or problematic, just hasn't been matched by the traditional varieties. The traditional varieties, on the other hand, are the Breton language, or at least they are the direct descendant of the language that those Britons came with. There is still a certain level of prestige or authenticity that learning a traditional variety holds for a neo-speaker, but with a rapidly aging population of traditional speakers, learning one will soon become even less of a non-trivial task than it already is. There have been some institutional attempts towards bridging this linguistic gap, but the timer is ticking, and let's be honest, we're probably already out of time. From my perspective, the only future I see is one where Standard Breton reigns supreme. There are some groups that are vehemently against the rule of WWII, but they are a minority, and there's not really another solution. I don't think that traditional and Standard Breton are totally irreconcilable, but I don't know how many people are working towards or interested in a reconciliation, which would be more difficult than just choosing Standard Breton and largely forgetting the varieties. Another dynamic completely absent from this video is that Gallo, the Romance language traditionally spoken in Upper Brittany, has been kind of put on the back burner. As Breton has taken the role of the national language of Brittany, Gallo is without place. Kind of ironically, there are more children learning Breton in schools in Nantes and Rennes alone than there are children learning Gallo in school in total. But I'll leave a deeper analysis of Gallo for another video. Now, I know a lot of people are going to see this situation and think it's silly. In addition to the usual attitude that a language like Breton has no use, people will also say that Standard Breton is doubly useless, as it alienates the largest portion of existing Breton speakers. I challenge you to think about this differently, though. There exists a serious hostility towards linguistic diversity. Time and time and time again, I have read the opinion that language death is natural, no matter how planned its demise was. But language revitalization is always a concerted and unnatural fabrication construed by a small minority of crazies. I really hope you see the self-contradictory nature in holding both these opinions. These are both unnatural processes, they're just both parts of history. Similar to how a certain group of people may be offended by linguistic innovation while failing to recognize their language is a product of linguistic innovation, a certain group of people may be offended by language revitalization because it's unnatural while failing to recognize language death is unnatural just as often. Czech, for example, is a product of language revitalization. 200 years ago, no one of any status spoke Czech, and it was abandoned in school. Today, it's the first language of 10 million people. What language hasn't had a period of unnatural antiquating like Breton is having now? At the heart of language change, there is seemingly a natural process, but history plainly shows us that this is very often influenced by planned and so-called unnatural human intervention. Don't misunderstand me. We shouldn't go around resurrecting every language. Sumerian would be a silly language to resurrect. But we're here talking about Breton, and a majority of the people living here believe that the Breton language is an important part of their identity and is worth preserving. A total 180 from the perspective held 2 to 3 generations prior. This video was lots of fun to make. I really enjoyed the extra challenge of making 2 versions. There's a version of this video in French, and if you speak French better than English, I hope you watch that one. But anyway, I accept one-time donations here, and if you have $5 to spare, I would greatly appreciate it. Can this language be preserved? Right now, it's honestly hard to say. The enthusiasm is in place, but there is a pretty marked lack of action. Currently, under 5% of Breton children get a bilingual or immersion education, but this number has only been increasing since bilingual education has become an option. One of the biggest problems at the moment, and one that will only get worse as the older generation continues to pass away, is that once these children graduate school, they don't have many places to use their Breton skills due to the highly fragmented geography of traditional and standard Breton. One of the highest priorities here should be the creation of environments outside of the school where Breton is the main vector of communication. Breton is currently in its infancy when it comes to this, if it has even really started at all. Nonetheless, the number of speakers under 40 has gone from, well, almost nothing to a small base. And like many other languages of France, the language can be quite visible in Brittany. So, if I were to rank the two Celtic languages we've covered so far in terms of their viability, Breton would, unsurprisingly, fall below Welsh.